salt water ever since late January of 1862. Iron bottoms are conducive to marine growth. Also, it was a very uncomfortable ship, as I've told people before. You know, in the summer, it was terrible because of the heat. The blowers didn't work properly. So the bilge had flies and mosquitoes. And it was, as William Keeler would say, hot, hottest, hotter, you know, larger letters with each one. Forgive me, my darling, for my ink is running because my sweat has dropped on the page. So the Monitor had proven to be a successful warship in a harbor, but it has not proven to be a comfortable ship to be in. And this is a problem, especially they have somewhat of an experimental engine, one designed by John Erickson, that actually never maintained the knots it was supposed to. So the boilers were overworked and they needed overhaul. And so there were all these problems with the Monitor. And so basically, the Monitor went from being up at Harrison's Landing in August of 1862 to City Point because they were worried that the Confederates were building another ironclad, and they actually were. They had started it at Gosport Navy Yard, taking it up to Richmond, the Rockets Navy Yard, and wow, what do you know, that the Union were all suffering from Merrimack on the brain. They thought that thing was going to come out at any time, and they only had one ironclad to stop it. And the CSS Richmond, they all called in September. Well, the Union called it the Virginia too, and so they were fearful of what it might do. So that's why they were left off of Newport News Point, within yards of the wreck of the Cumberland. They actually would row over there, and the masts were still showing from the Cumberland, and so they take stuff off and doodle, make little carvings and things like that. George Gear would sell them. I mean, he was very, he sold everything he could. So I have to say, but the Monitor was in bad shape. Its engines were malfunctioning. The marine growth meant it could not make more than 4 knots. And so when you're supposed to make 7, that's pretty devastating for your ship. And so the Monitor was going to be refitted, and the best place to refit it was the Washington Navy Yard. Now, believe it or not, this is the first Navy Yard. Now, some say Gosport or Norfolk Naval Shipyard is, but that's a technical thing. Gosport was built originally in 1767, but it wasn't owned by the United States Navy. U.S. Navy owned the land and owned every building on here from the very beginning. I have to say that the Washington Navy Yard is the best place they can go. Now, I have to say the Monitor's engines were such terrible condition that it could not make the trip up the Chesapeake Bay, up the Potomac to the Anacostia River. So she has to be towed by this ship, this tug called Rescue. Now, Rescue also needed repair. So you can well imagine their slow progress up the bay. In fact, it took them a whole day just to get to Point Lookout, Maryland. And, you would think they'd do better. And they stopped there because they didn't want to operate at night. And the next day, they went up the tortuous Potomac River, filled with sandbars. I mean, it's not a place for ships to really pass. So when they get to the mouth of the Anacostia River, I got to tell you, the rescue cuts loose of the tow line so the Monitor can come into the Navy Yard amidst cheers and huzzas. And they were accompanied by a swarm of small craft filled with onlookers. As the Monitor passed, steamed by up to the wharf, it was received with cheers, gun salutes. The officers met by crowds, huzzazing at every moment for their service that brought them to Washington Navy Yard. Now, this becomes a huge thing because they are overwhelmed by the crowds. Everyone wants to see the little ship that saved the nation. And so they pack the Washington Navy Yard. They have to set up a Marine detachment to guard it. But still, William Keeler describes the chaotic situation to his wife. Our decks were covered, our wardrobe filled with ladies. On going into my stateroom, I found a party of dear, delightful creatures making their toilet before my glass. That's mirror, that's putting on makeup. That's just to let you know. And using my comb and brushes, we couldn't go to any part of the vessel without coming in contact with petticoats. They appeared a general turn and out of the sex in the city, and they were women and children and women without children, women here and there, women expecting, a sense of display of lower extremities was made going up and down the ladders. The deck was lined with carriages, and it was a perfect log jam that had happened when the ship showed up. I'll just tell you that there were some crewmen that stood guard at the bottom of ladders just so they would have the opportunity to, in case you're not, that's a quote from William Keeler, just to look up the dresses of the ladies. Actually, when the Monitor shows up, two brothels open. One is called the Monitor and one is called the Iron Battery. Now, I don't know, it's going to draw a lot of crowds, but maybe they're trying to get those Monitor boys into their hands or clutches. So anyway, the onlookers were overwhelming. Now, the Washington Navy Yard was created after the establishment of the U.S. Navy. The land was purchased by Act of Congress, 23 July 1799, and it was formally established as a Navy Yard in October of 1799. Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Stoddard will be there to cut the ribbon or will have the ceremony that declared it a yard for the U.S. Navy. And it was supposed to become the most advanced yard in America. Now, the person who commanded it was Thomas Tingley, and he was famous for commanding the USS Ganges during the quasi-war with France. Now, he stayed as commandant from 1800 until 1829 when he died. So it was a good job to have. Now, I have to tell you, the yard had produced tremendous ships. They had refitted during the War of at the beginning of the War of 1812, the USF Constellation, the USS Constitution. Actually, the last major ship it built was the USS Minnesota. Now, the Minnesota has a draft of 23.9 feet, and the Anacostia River was too shallow, really, to handle that. So they had to get it out of the yard to then arm the ship and weight it down with everything. But the yard had become I have to say, a center for technology and ordnance, in part because since the river was too shallow for big boats, actually one of the chief of ordnance at the yard, later the chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, John Dahlgren, will use all this manufacturing tools to be able to create what? The Dahlgren gun and the Dahlgren boat gun. Now, these are significant inventions, and they set up a gun factory that you can see. That's one of the ship houses. Believe it or not, all the buildings, well, I'll give you a quote by Anne Royal. She said, now remember, the yard was burned during the War of 1812, then rebuilt. The Navy Yard is complete workshop. Everything is manufactured. It contains 22 forges, 5 furnaces, a steam engine. The shops are large and convenient. They're built of brick covered with copper to secure them from fire. Steel is prepared here with great facility. The whole interior of the yard exhibits one continued thundering of hammers, axes, saws, bellows, sending forth such a variety of smells from the profusion of coal, dust, and being burnt in the furnaces that it requires the strongest nerves to sustain the racket, as they say. And so the yard is still making ships, but it can only make small ships. And so the yard, really, as I said, this is the main gate to the yard, and that's the gun factory. Actually, that's a later view of the gun factory, but this is where 8-inch, 9-inch Dahlgrens and boat howitzers were made for the U.S. Navy. So it's amazing what they could do. Now, I have to tell you that the Monitor was not to welcome visitors at first, so that the officers were transferred to the dispatched vessel King Philip. And King Philip is formerly known as the Powhatan, and it has 204 feet in length, 22-foot beam, and 8-foot draft. Now, guess what? Beforehand, it was a dispatched vessel for the U.S. Navy, but before the war, it was a passenger ship. And guess what? It had great accommodations. So the crew loved the fact that they had been assigned to this improved ship. However, Captain Bankhead he went on leave immediately, and he left orders that the officers could take 1 month leave and the enlisted men could take 14-day leaves. The last person to leave the yard is going to be William Keeler. Why? Because William Keeler was the paymaster, and so he had to dole out all the pay to everyone coming. He had maintained a record of everything coming back onto the ship, because the ship was stripped clean. And I have to tell you, as Keeler would say, the docks were lined with carriages and left in a perfect jam. No caravan or circus ever collected a crowd like this. They enjoyed the attention of the large number of ladies that came to see the ship. We've already told about looking up their petticoats. Guards were stationed, Marine Guard were stationed all around, and for very good reasons. Some of these visitors are being very interested in the ship. One day, October 6, Benjamin Brown French, Commissioner of Public Buildings, toured the Monitor, and he wrote, "We got almost to the hour before I saw her, and such an insignificant looking craft for a war steamer I ever saw or dreamed of. A cheese box on the raft expresses her appearance better than anything else, and those on board the Merrimac must have been utterly astonished to see such a thing come boldly up and give the monster battle to force her back to her lair. That's kind of the way the Union looked at the battle. I won't comment. So actually, French joined up with Major General Nathaniel Prentice Banks and his wife, and they went on a continued tour. After, actually, French examined everything about the wonderful craft, saw the very slight effect that with the shot of the Merrimac had upon her iron sides, deck, and turret. After a half hour, they went on to look at other ships. However, we left about sunset after a curiosity much gratified. In fact, he knew then that this was a special ship. Now, they had to guard it as they're making changes. Now, what I did is I used some images of the interior of the Monitor, but also of the Passaic class ships that were just being produced. So, based on the written complaints of William Jeffers, who was the fourth commander of the Monitor, he wrote a nastygram to to Erickson, saying this ship is bad. This ship is hot. This ship doesn't do this, doesn't do that. Erickson gets all upset. He writes back and says, "You don't know what you're talking about. These are my answers, and I don't like you." Basically, is how he ended the letter. Erickson would do that sort of thing. But the comments of Jeffers become a guideline as they start to build a new class of monitors known as the Passaic class. Now, what that meant was that the ship had certain necessary improvements to be made. The engines were completely overhauled and the bottom thoroughly clean. They discovered that they did not have to replace the boilers. And to make the ship more seaworthy, they built what are called armored smokestack. So you took the two smokestacks and it kind of went up like that. We'll see pictures of it, and it then goes straight up. And it was 30 feet above the water. The blowers had a 10-foot stack to allow air to come in, and that was trying to stop the water from coming in to both of those two places. It worked with the smokestack. It did not work with the blowers very well. And so I have to say, this is, of course, the difference between Monitor and Passaic. You can see right there, there's a 15-inch Dahlgren. There is an 11-inch Dahlgren. And they have a lot of headroom, but they didn't really have that. Bankhead had left instructions on some of the things that really needed to be done. Now, remember, the big problem was that we had to stop water from coming into the ship. And so even though it was recommended to extend the hull with sponsons out to the deck of the ship to stop the water coming up underneath the Monitor when it's in a storm, they didn't do that. And so they didn't fix one of the major problems with the Monitor. And that left much to be desired. But, as William Keeler would say, it was a brand new ship. Actually, he noted, Louis Stoddard noted that every doorknob every escutcheon, every lamp, everything that could be moved was taken by the crowds as their keepsakes of the Monitor. And so they had to put all new stuff in. I mean, if you were on the Monitor, famous ship, what would you do? Well, I'd sneak it up my petticoat. I don't know. But that was a constant complaint. So they had to limit people coming on board. Now, I have to say that the guard, one of the guards, actually, Richard Carter, tripped over a large rope and fell into the dry dock and drowned. And that sounds odd, but in essence, the dry dock had been filled with water because it was getting ready to put the Monitor back out. And so he is the only casualty related to the time in, I don't want to talk to him yet. I think one of the great things is that, okay, so first, you know, the ship was paneled. You can go in the Monitor Center and see it. Well, the ship had burned. Remember, in the summer, they had a fire from the smokestack of the stove that caught the wood paneling on fire, and the galley was right next to the magazine. So they were kind of desperate to put that out, and they did, but all that had to be replaced. And I have to say that they actually added davits and cranes to the ship so it could carry its own ship's boats. Okay, and that's very, very important. They usually, the Monitor would drag a ship's boat behind it. In this case, you can put it into the water. I just have to reflect that those boats were not on the Monitor when it hit the storm because they said, oh, we want to save them, we don't want to lose them. Well, you know, that added to the problems. Now, once they repaired all of the wood damage from the fire, and the berth deck was then enlarged, this was accomplished by removing the side storerooms, which gave 8 feet more width in which to work. The floor of the berth deck was raised, and below it were placed 2 storerooms for provisions and a shell room. One of the problems with the Monitor is they store ammunition all over the place. And so you think you're in an ironclad, as George Gear said, but it too can burn. William Keeler noted that the reduced room's height, we can barely stand straight up without hitting our head on the deck above. He also wrote it so that we can, however, it is what we want, is more working space. A large blower with its own engine was installed partly above and below the deck. The blower was designed to draw air down through the turret and through the deck lights when open, and in the wardroom and staterooms forces it into the engine room to aid the draft of the furnaces. George Gear thought that the blowers next summer will be very nice. Blows such a blast that would knock one down. Keeler felt all these additions were very important and gave the crew, when they eventually come back on the ship, a greater sense that this ship would actually do very well in the future. I have to tell you, when the crew starts to come back, not everyone comes back. This is my favorite deserter. I won't tell you the story about him too much, but this is Wilhelm Durst, and he actually, the great thing is, he writes after the war about how heroic he was. He saved Worden. He did all this. He saved everybody during the sinking. Well, he wasn't on the boat at the sinking because he had deserted. And he gets a new name because of a tattoo he has, that it was WD. So he went from William Durst into Walter David. So, and he kept that name. The big thing, while in the Washington Navy Yard, we see a change in command. Actually, several people, there are 10 deserters, right, from the Monitor while it's at the Washington Navy Yard. And so you have to pick up more crew. Ordinary Seaman Jacob Nicholas noted, "I did not know what they intended doing with us," that they were on the receiving ship at the time. "Some say they're going to drill us and place us as forts, others say in gunboats, but I care not where. The Monitor lies in the yard present for repairs, and she will probably take some of us." As her crew ran away when they landed at the yard. And one of my favorite lines, "and on the account of her being so seaworthy. But since they had altered her, I think there'll be no danger." In fact, Jacob Nicholas did not want to go on the Monitor, and yet all his friends like Isaac Scott said, "Oh, let's do it. This is a famous ship, and we'll gain fame ourselves as a result of it." So we see changes in personnel as a result of the time in the Washington Navy Yard. Number one, Lieutenant William Fly was transferred off to take command of the underwriter. Daniel Long, the surgeon, decides not to, he finds another assignment, and he's replaced by Dr. Thomas W. Meckley, who had served as a U.S. Army surgeon, and last service was at the Battle of Antietam. And so when he got on the ship, right, he immediately asked for a transfer, because once again, you get on this little ship, and you don't feel safe. And so he's going to be replaced by, of course, Dr. Grenville Mellon Weeks, who stays with the vessel and actually writes a very excellent account of the sinking and so forth. And two other new officers were assigned to the Monitor. Actually, First Assistant Engineer Isaac Newton was transferred off the Monitor, which all of the men in the engine room reacted with great joy, according to George Gear. Now, he'll go on, he was a manic depressive, and he'll go on to commit suicide after the war. So it's not good to work with under a manic depressive, I reckon. So they will replace him with Second Assistant Engineer Albert Campbell, and he's now in charge of the engineer. They also get a Third Assistant Engineer, George White, and we will see that we have also Third Assistant Engineer Augie Lewis of Baltimore was assigned to the engine room. Keeler referred to Lewis as a mere boy, merely a cipher in our little society. The other officer that joined the ship was Norman Knox Altwater of New Haven, Connecticut. Now, this is also bringing on more men. Actually, the Monitor will carry a larger crew than she had when she first left the Brooklyn Navy Yard. She had 57, now she has 63. Many of the new recruits were contrabands, as they would call them then. Those are runaway enslaved people who got to Union lines and they have a sense of freedom. And many of them obviously want to serve in the Navy, because the Navy at this time was the only place where a person of African descent could serve. The Militia Act is not law until 1863, so we don't see the establishment of really United States colored troops until after that. So we have two contrabands, Robert Howard and Daniel Moore, that joined the crew. And, this was really pretty special. George Gear thought about the mass of these people that joined. He speculated that some of them, I suppose, will go on us. 10 of our men have not come back yet. And why did they not return from their furloughs? Well, because they knew the ship was bad. And everything they did, now they repainted the ship. They redid all the engine parts. They also improved the galley. They made the wall between the galley and the berth deck insulated, because before, the hottest temperature on that ship when it operated was the galley. They recorded to be as high as 140 degrees. Well, you can put the eggs in the pan and leave because it will be self-fried. But it was a very delicate situation for the repairs. Now, so we have to realize that the Monitor is going to be ready to go back down to Hampton Roads. And as it gets ready, they get the final new crew members like Frank Butts, Irish immigrants James Coleman, who becomes ship number 65, and John Monaghan, William Allen. So they have all these new crew members who actually George Gear calls them fat hogs, and they don't know really what to do. However, John Bankhead will decide, or will be ordered to leave the yard and go down the Chesapeake Bay beginning on 8 November 1862. So basically, the Monitor is going to be in the Washington Navy Yard for just a month. So no substantial changes are made other than the blower system, improvements to the engine. Her bottom is scraped, she is painted, and so she is made ready. But all these new standards we've created with the Passaic class monitors are going to be seen in some sense in the new Monitor. Perhaps one of the biggest things they overlooked was moving the pilot house from its detached position at the bow to on top of the turret, as they did with Passaic class and other subsequent monitors. But the ship was greatly improved and went down to Hampton Roads and was there until it would be ordered on December 25, 1862, to go south to Beaufort, North Carolina. So that's what happens with the refit of the Monitor. So there's some neat things they did. Number one, they noted all the indentations. And so some of the crew members told the workers, well, this was from the Merrimac's prow, and this was from Fort Darling, Drury's Bluff. And so they put iron patches over them. None of those patches survived when the ship is recovered. So obviously they only did so good of a job in patching the engine, the plates. The plates weren't cracked, and that was the biggest thing, that it would lose its strength. This is, of course, the Port Dahlgren, 11-inch Dahlgren. And so the workmen in the Washington Navy Yard will mark both ships. The starboard gun was mounted with Erickson, Monitor, and Merrimac. The port gun was named in honor of Worden, as we can see, Worden, Monitor, and Merrimac. And when you read about that they marked the guns, it was unsure whether they put it in chalk. What did they do? But of course, when the gun is brought up, you can clearly see that they engraved it into the tube. And actually, on a good day, you can see it in the tank. And soon they'll be on display. So basically, during all the hubbub in the Navy Yard, there was one man that name is R.P. Crompton. And he toured the ship, made a lot of notes. And as he was leaving, he went up to the guardhouse and he said, I'm a Southern man and that the South is going to be successful. And as for the Monitor, she was a damned humbug. Of course, they arrested him right away. We talk about spies. Some are smart, some are not. But actually, we know the Confederacy has spies in New York and in the Washington Navy Yard, so that they have a very good concept of what is happening to the ship. So the refit to the USS Monitor was successful in cleaning up her inside, improving conditions for the crew, making her actually be able to gain the 7 knots. Erickson's contract said he had to have 9 knots, but they were satisfied with 7. And so the Monitor appeared ready to begin work with the rest of the ironclad fleet that was going to be being brought together at Beaufort, North Carolina, for a proposed attack on Wilmington, North Carolina. The big trouble is, there are 2 inlets into the Cape Fear River, New Inlet, Old Inlet, and guess what? None of the monitors could get through that channel. They gave up on that plan. And later, of course, the Monitor never made it to Beaufort. But that's another story for another time.
Thank you so much, John.